Well, thank you for having me today, and I'm excited to be here working with UNDP and Yeti Airlines on this particular project. And in a general rule or a general perspective for companies to be able to demonstrate and actually make progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals, there's a few steps that need to be taken. One is taking account of their current impacts, which could include environmental and social and anything that falls within the realm of sustainability. Once they've kind of taken a little bit of their assessment, so this could be, for example, with Yeti Airlines, doing an inventory of their carbon emissions. So this helps demonstrate a more scientific approach of showing what their environmental impact is. And once that step has been taken, then they can take the next steps, which is helping to reduce those impacts. There are a lot of different guidelines and best practices and standards for measuring, for example, carbon emissions. So there's emission factors for national electricity grids that says for every kilowatt hour, it's equal to this amount of CO2 equivalent. There's for fuel being burned in a car, we know how much emissions of greenhouse gases will be produced for each liter or kilogram of type of fuel burned. So using those standards and those metrics, a company can then perform this inventory internally. The other steps would then be to report on that information and also the commitments being made. And then you can bring in external auditors for different disclosure mechanisms. There's the Global Reporting Index, there's Global Compact, there's G8, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which is measured by the World Resource Institute, which helps define a lot of those standards. The process started with requesting data from them, including fuel used for vehicles, their facility grid electricity used. We're able to take all that information and produce a preliminary carbon footprint or carbon impact assessment, so a greenhouse gas inventory. And we're in the process of finalizing the data. We also are looking at different metrics such as amount of emissions per passenger, per kilometer, per revenue. And this is the way a lot of the different organizations, especially, for example, airline industry, are able to compare and benchmark to understand, are we higher than what's average? Are we below? Are we doing good? And the more, obviously, data that comes in, the more airlines that do this, the better they're able to understand where they position and where they need to focus. My recent work on this project with Yeti Airlines, I've come across several different that are worth highlighting. KLM out of the Netherlands has put a tremendous amount of effort and resources into trying to reduce their environmental impacts, but also they've experienced a lot of financial savings due to this. And it involves things such as reducing the load on the plane, so the amount of weight. So they've looked at how heavy are the food trays that we're carrying around in the carts, how heavy are the trays on the back of a seat, what kind of utensils are they using. They're using biodegradable materials instead of plastic. And then there's other organizations that are looking at very technical aspects, such as Boeing, who has done extensive investigations in flight takeoff and flight descent, as far as what's the best angle and how to best descend onto the airplane, onto the tarmac with the least amount of fuel being used. Also, there's a lot of work going into air traffic control to keep planes from having to hold in the air or on the ground. And then there's airlines such as in the US, like Southwest, that have been doing a lot of great work. And then you have your low-cost airlines in Europe, where their motto is to try to get as many people on the plane. So that way, per passenger, you have a very low emissions. One of the worst things, obviously, is flying a plane with nobody on it. It's like driving a big bus and only having one person on it, then it's very inefficient. Well, the typical way right now, because of the aviation industry as it exists, it's almost impossible to have zero emissions just through reductions. They are working on alternative energy fuels, so biofuels for airplanes, and there are some airplanes that run off of it. It's quite expensive right now, but we hope in the future, in the long run, that that's the solution to achieve carbon neutrality. Carbon neutrality focuses more on the typical greenhouse gases that exist, so carbon dioxide, methane, N2O. These are the ones that contribute towards global warming and ultimately climate change. So when an organization wants to become carbon neutral, they're focusing mostly on taking an inventory and account of those emissions and then reducing them and then offsetting what can be reduced. Climate neutrality looks at other impacts on the climate. So this could be waste management, for example, water management, noise pollution, health and safety. So, of the community. So there's a lot of other aspects that go into climate neutrality and trying to basically demonstrate that there is either a net zero or a net negative impact on those other areas, which that covers more areas of the Sustainable Development Goals as well. Carbon, it focuses a lot on the environmental impact, but there are some overlap, but the climate neutrality is kind of the next step. You need it from both sides. You need the private sector to make efforts for example, for better business practices, more efficiency, oftentimes profit-driven, but like I said, it translates to reductions in impacts as well. From the government side, they need to implement policies that are across the board, because oftentimes if you only have one organization or a few organizations doing this, it doesn't always get spread across to all of them. So by implementing subsidiaries, for example, or subsidies, for example, or we've even been discussing the idea of a carbon tax in collaboration with the Civil Aviation Authority here in Nepal. Is like one idea is if every airline did a carbon tax, then that would be a very small impact on each passenger. We're talking maybe equivalent of half a US dollar per ticket or something like that. But it equates to a significant amount of money overall, which can then be used for reduction projects and offsetting for the airlines. So and from the UN perspective, I think, and also NGOs, they're the external stakeholders that have to keep an eye on what's going on and to ensure that the decisions that are being made at the government level, and the UN can then ensure that they're implementing it properly and then monitor the results and ensure that everything's going in the right direction, and they provide assistance on that.